The wind reaches the city before memory does. It moves softly across the Sahara, lifting grains of sand like whispers, carrying with it echoes of caravans long gone, prayers half forgotten, and the faint metallic scent of gold that once changed the fate of the world. Before stone walls appear, before minarets rise from the earth, before any name is spoken, there's only silence and wind. And in that silence, a city waits to be remembered. Long ago, while much of Europe struggled beneath the weight of scarcity, where candles were precious, books were rare, and hunger was familiar, there existed a city in Africa so wealthy, so learned, so alive with ideas that it bent the imagination of those who heard of it. A city where gold dust clung to clothes like pollen, where libraries outnumbered palaces, where scholars were valued as highly as kings. Its name was Timbuktu. Yet today, that name often arrives stripped of meaning, reduced to myth, joke, or exaggeration. A place imagined rather than understood. A symbol disconnected from its truth. But history does not forget by accident. It forgets by design. And the first question that rises from the desert wind is not how Timbuktu rose, but who decided it should fade. In the medieval world, wealth was loud. It built castles. It crowned monarchs. It marched under banners and declared itself in blood and steel. But Timbuktu's wealth was quieter. It whispered through parchment and ink, through debates held beneath oil lamps, through caravans that carried not only gold and salt, but stories, ideas, and law. It was wealth that did not need to announce itself, because it already understood its value. To imagine the world into which Timbuktu was born, you must step away from the maps drawn in classrooms and the timelines taught as inevitability. You must forget the idea that progress moves in one direction, that civilization has a single birthplace, that history flows outward from Europe like light from a sun. In the medieval mind, Europe was not the center of the world. It was often its periphery. Across much of Europe, life was narrow and fragile. Literacy was confined to monasteries. Knowledge was locked behind Latin, guarded by institutions that rationed learning as power. Economies were local, brittle, dependent on harvests that could fail and wars that could erase decades overnight. For most people, the world ended at the edge of their village. But south of the Mediterranean, across the vast spine of the Sahara, another reality unfolded. West Africa was threaded together by trade routes older than kingdoms. Paths carved not by conquest alone, but by necessity, trust, and exchange. Gold moved north, salt moved south, and between them traveled something far more enduring: knowledge. Merchants did not merely carry goods. They carried news, legal traditions, religious ideas, and intellectual currents that linked cities separated by thousands of miles. In this world, wealth was measured not only by what you owned, but by what you understood. The empires of West Africa did not rise accidentally. They were built at the intersection of geography and vision. Rivers became arteries. Deserts became highways. And at the center of it all stood a growing power, one that understood the value of stability in a world shaped by movement. The Mali Empire emerged not through sudden conquest, but through control. Control of gold fields whose output quietly fueled economies far beyond Africa's shores. Control of trade routes that connected sub-Saharan Africa to North Africa, the Middle East, and eventually Europe itself. Control of law, which allowed merchants to trade without fear, scholars to debate without threat, and cities to grow without collapsing into chaos. And at a crucial crossroads of these routes, Timbuktu began to breathe. At first, it was little more than a seasonal camp, a resting place near the Niger River where traders paused, exchanged goods, and listened. But crossroads have a way of becoming centers. What begins as a stop becomes a meeting. What begins as a meeting becomes a city. Timbuktu absorbed the rhythm of the caravans. Camel bells ringing at dawn, the hiss of sand underfoot, the careful weighing of gold dust against scales so precise they bordered on reverence. Gold shimmered here, yes, but did not dominate. It flowed. The true foundation of Timbuktu was not its material wealth, but its openness. An openness to people, to ideas, to the belief that learning was not a luxury, but a responsibility. As the Mali Empire expanded, Timbuktu transformed. Mosques rose not only as places of worship, but as centers of education. Homes became libraries. Conversations became curricula. And then came the man who would turn the world's attention, however briefly, toward this African heart of wealth and wisdom. Mansa Musa did not inherit an empire in chaos. He inherited one already powerful, already prosperous. But what he did with that inheritance reshaped global history. His ascent was quiet, his rule deliberate, and his understanding of wealth was unlike anything the medieval world had seen. When he set out on pilgrimage to Mecca, he did not do so as a penitent seeking anonymity. He traveled as a sovereign whose generosity would ripple across continents. His caravan stretched beyond the horizon. Thousands of attendants, soldiers, servants, and camels laden with gold. Not symbolically, literally. So much gold that when it was distributed freely in cities like Cairo, it destabilized local economies. Prices soared. Gold lost value. The world took notice. In markets and courts far from Africa, rumors spread of a king so wealthy he could give away fortunes without flinching. Of an empire that produced more gold than any other known land. European mapmakers, startled by stories they could not ignore, began to sketch him into their world, often seated on a throne, holding a nugget of gold, as if wealth itself were his language. But Mansa Musa understood something those observers did not. Gold was not his greatest asset. When he returned from Mecca, he brought with him scholars, architects, and books. He invested not in monuments alone, but in minds. Timbuktu flourished under his patronage, becoming a magnet for learning. Universities expanded. Manuscripts multiplied. Students arrived from across the Islamic world, drawn not by spectacle, but by reputation. In Timbuktu, education was currency. A scholar could command respect equal to any noble. Books were inherited, traded, and protected with care bordering on devotion. Law, astronomy, medicine, theology, and philosophy were studied not as abstractions, but as tools for living well in a complex world. At night, lamps glowed in study halls as debates stretched into dawn. Ink dried on parchment as hands copied texts that would survive centuries. Knowledge accumulated quietly, patiently, without asking permission from those who would later claim to define civilization. This was Timbuktu at its height. Not a myth, not a rumor, not a legend inflated by distance, but a living city whose wealth was measured in understanding. Yet history is not kind to truths that challenge its favored narratives. Trade routes shift, empires fracture, power migrates. Timbuktu did not burn in a single night. It did not collapse beneath invading armies. Instead, it faded from the global imagination as attention turned elsewhere. European expansion reframed the world, recasting Africa not as a source of knowledge, but as a blank space to be filled, a silence to be spoken over. Colonial narratives dismissed what they did not build. Libraries were ignored. Manuscripts were scattered or hidden. A city that had once educated the world was reduced to a footnote, then a myth, then a punchline. Forgetting proved more effective than destruction. But forgetting is never complete, because Timbuktu still breathes. Its manuscripts still exist, protected by families who understood their value even when the world did not. Its legacy waits beneath layers of dust and denial, patient as the desert wind. The question is no longer whether Timbuktu was real. The evidence is undeniable. The question is whether we are willing to confront what its story reveals about history itself. Who decides what is remembered? Who decides what is erased? And what does it mean when the richest city of its age is written out of the story? The wind continues to move across the Sahara, and the city continues to wait. Timbuktu did not announce its greatness with walls or armies. It revealed itself slowly through patterns of life that valued understanding over spectacle. To walk its streets at its height was to feel the presence of thought everywhere. Spoken aloud, argued gently, refined patiently. Knowledge here was not locked away behind elites. It moved, it circulated, it breathed. Students arrived young and uncertain, carrying little more than curiosity and borrowed parchment. They came from across West Africa, from the Maghreb, from the Middle East, following a reputation built not on conquest but credibility. They came because they had heard that in this city, questions were welcomed. That debate was encouraged. That learning was not something hoarded by institutions but shared as a communal responsibility. The Sankor Mosque was not merely a place of prayer. It was a university long before the word carried prestige in Europe. Its courtyards echoed with discussion. Its halls were lined with shelves of handwritten texts, carefully copied, annotated, preserved. Astronomy charts mapped the heavens. Legal manuscripts outlined systems of justice. Medical texts recorded treatments refined through observation rather than superstition. Philosophy asked questions that did not fear uncertainty. Books were everywhere, not mass-produced, not disposable. Each one was a labor of patience, copied by hand, inked with intention. To own books was a mark of status, not because they were expensive, though they often were, but because they represented commitment. Commitment to thought, to memory, to continuity. Families passed down libraries as inheritances. Manuscripts were wrapped, hidden, protected from moisture and theft. Some were carried across generations the way others carried jewels. Because in Timbuktu, ideas were wealth. And wealth, once understood, demanded care. Outside, the city thrummed with trade. Caravans arrived in waves, camels moving in long lines that seemed endless against the horizon. Gold dust traveled in small leather pouches, weighed carefully, exchanged without drama. Salt blocks, essential for survival, were stacked like bricks. But between these transactions flowed conversations about distant rulers, new interpretations of law, shifting political alliances, discoveries made by scholars whose names would never appear in European textbooks. Timbuktu was not isolated. It was deeply connected. Its scholars corresponded with peers in Cairo, Fez, Mecca. Ideas moved faster than armies ever could. And because of this, the city became something rare, a place where power did not silence thought, but amplified it. This balance was not accidental. It was cultivated. Mansa Musa understood that an empire built solely on gold would eventually collapse beneath its own weight. Gold attracts envy. Knowledge builds resilience. Under his patronage, scholars were protected. Architects were invited to design structures that combined beauty with function. Mosques and schools were built not as symbols of dominance, but as investments in continuity. When visitors arrived from abroad, they expected spectacle. They found substance. They left changed. And yet, this richness, this invisible wealth, was difficult for outsiders to comprehend. European chroniclers who heard of Timbuktu often fixated on gold because it fit their understanding of value. They described riches in terms of metal and excess, rarely pausing to ask what sustained such prosperity. The manuscripts were mentioned in passing, if at all. The scholars reduced to background figures. This selective attention would later become deliberate omission. As centuries passed, global power shifted. Maritime routes replaced desert caravans. The Atlantic world rose. The Sahara, once a bridge, became framed as a barrier. Timbuktu's centrality faded not because it failed, but because the world chose new centers. Then came narratives that needed Africa to be empty in order to be claimed. Colonial powers arrived with maps that erased complexity. They described Africa as timeless, static, undeveloped. Timbuktu did not fit this story. A city with universities older than many European ones disrupted the myth of civilizational hierarchy. So it was easier to dismiss it as exaggeration, or fantasy, or coincidence. Libraries were neglected. Manuscripts were sold, stolen, or left to decay. Scholars were ignored. The city's intellectual lineage was severed from the global record. What was not destroyed was silenced. And silence, when repeated long enough, becomes belief. By the time modern historians began asking new questions, the damage was already done. Timbuktu existed more as an idea than a place, invoked as shorthand for distance, obscurity, irrelevance. A joke, a metaphor, not a monument to human achievement. Yet beneath that distortion, the truth endured. In private homes, families hid manuscripts during periods of unrest, wrapping them in cloth, burying them in chests, carrying them across generations with quiet determination. They understood that history might turn away, but time would not erase what was protected. These texts survived droughts, invasions, neglect. They waited, and now, as scholars rediscover them, as pages are restored and cataloged, a different story emerges. One that refuses simplification. One that insists Africa was not waiting to be enlightened, but actively producing enlightenment on its own terms. The realization is unsettling, because it forces a reevaluation not just of Timbuktu, but of the frameworks through which history has been taught. If Timbuktu was this rich, this advanced, this intellectually alive, what else has been overlooked? What other civilizations were diminished because they did not fit the narrative of progress defined elsewhere? This is the true legacy of Timbuktu. Not gold, not legend, but disruption. Disruption of assumptions. Disruption of hierarchies. Disruption of the idea that greatness requires permission. The city's decline was not marked by fire or collapse. It was marked by absence from memory, by omission, by a choice repeated across generations. But omission can be reversed, because history is not fixed. It is revised by those willing to look again. Timbuktu still stands. Its streets still feel the desert wind. Its manuscripts still whisper truths that refuse to fade. And its story, once silenced, now demands to be heard, not as an anomaly, but as evidence. Evidence that wealth can be quiet, that power can be intellectual, that civilization has always been more diverse, more complex, and more distributed than the stories we inherited. And once that realization takes hold, the world looks different. The final resistance to Timbuktu's truth does not come from doubt. It comes from discomfort. Because once you accept that this city existed as it truly was, wealthy, educated, influential, you're forced to confront how fragile the stories we rely on really are. You're forced to ask whether the version of history handed down to you was incomplete by accident or incomplete by design. History is often described as a record of events, but in practice, it is a record of emphasis, of repetition, of what is elevated and what is allowed to fade. It is shaped not only by what happened, but by who had the power to write, to teach, and to preserve their version of the past. Timbuktu was not forgotten because it was insignificant. It was forgotten because it was inconvenient. Its existence disrupts a familiar narrative, that progress moves outward from a single center, that civilization flows in one direction, that modernity has a clear and exclusive lineage. Timbuktu complicates that story. It reveals a world where Africa was not waiting to be shaped by history, but actively shaping it, intellectually, economically, philosophically. And that truth unsettles. Because if Timbuktu was real in all its complexity, then the silence around it cannot be explained by ignorance alone. Silence, when it stretches across centuries, becomes intention. As global power shifted, so did memory. Trade routes that once sustained the city weakened as maritime empires rose. Political authority fractured. Timbuktu lost its centrality, not because it failed, but because the world reorganized itself around new priorities. Yet even then, decline did not mean disappearance. The city endured. Its scholars remained. Its manuscripts multiplied. What changed was not Timbuktu, but the lens through which the world chose to see it. When colonial powers arrived in Africa, they brought more than weapons and borders. They brought narratives. Narratives that required Africa to appear empty of intellectual history, so that domination could be framed as rescue. Narratives that described complexity as absence and achievement as anomaly. A city like Timbuktu did not fit. A city with universities older than many in Europe did not fit. A city where books were traded like gold did not fit. A city where scholars shaped law, science, and philosophy without European validation did not fit. So it was reduced, simplified, dismissed. Libraries were ignored. Manuscripts were scattered or taken. Scholars were unnamed. Over time, Timbuktu transformed in the global imagination from a real place into a rumor, a joke, a metaphor for distance and obscurity. Its name survived, but its meaning was hollowed out. This is how erasure works. Not through destruction, but through neglect. Not through fire, but through silence. And silence is powerful. It teaches generations what not to look for. It trains curiosity away from certain places, certain people, certain questions. Eventually, absence feels natural. Eventually, no one asks why the gap exists at all. Yet erasure is never complete, because knowledge has a way of resisting disappearance. In Timbuktu, families understood what was at stake long before historians did. When unrest threatened, manuscripts were hidden, wrapped in cloth, buried in chests, passed quietly from parent to child. They were protected not because they were famous, but because they mattered. These texts survived heat, sand, war, and indifference. They waited, and now, as they resurface, cataloged, translated, studied, they tell a story that refuses to stay small. A story of legal debates as rigorous as any medieval court, of astronomical observations recorded with precision, of medical knowledge grounded in experience, a philosophy that wrestled openly with ethics, governance, and faith. This was not borrowed knowledge. It was produced. The realization carries weight, because it means the intellectual map of the past must be redrawn. It means that the Renaissance was not the sudden awakening of a sleeping world, but one moment in a much wider, interconnected human conversation. It means that Africa was never outside history. It was written out of it. And once that is understood, the question changes. Is no longer was Timbuktu important? It becomes, why were we taught that it wasn't? Who controls history? Who decides which civilizations are celebrated and which are minimized? Who benefits from a past that appears smaller, simpler, and more convenient than it truly was? Timbuktu stands at the center of those questions, not as a myth to be admired from afar, but as evidence that history has always been more complex than the stories we inherit. The city still breathes today, in its quiet streets, in its mud brick walls, in the manuscripts that survived because ordinary people believed truth was worth protecting, even when no one else was watching. Some cities fall to ruins. Others fall to silence. Timbuktu endured the latter. But silence is not an ending. It is a pause. And pauses exist to be broken. The desert wind still moves across the Sahara, indifferent to borders and narratives. It passes over the same ground where scholars once walked, where students once argued beneath oil lamps, where pages turned and ideas took shape. It carries with it a reminder, soft, persistent, impossible to erase. Truth does not vanish because it is ignored. Knowledge does not lose value because it is denied. And civilization does not require permission to exist. Timbuktu is proof, not as legend, not as exaggeration, but as a challenge to how history is told and to who gets to tell it. Some cities fall, others are silenced, but truth waits.